Welcome everybody to this episode of Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. Absolutely thrilled and delighted to be joined by Shruthi Kumar. Shruthi, thank you so much for being with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
I have to tell you, there was obviously a lot of buzz around your work and your speech, the graduation speech you gave. And yet the summer has been hopefully a time for peace and reflection and kind of letting things simmer from there. But I'm actually curious about one thing. Are you constantly now discovering more ways to execute and even exemplify the power of kind of not knowing?
Yeah, so it's interesting when I came up with kind of what I wanted to write about for the speech, I kind of I kind of walked into the speech writing process with this thing of like the power of not knowing sitting on my shoulders, right? Um it's a there's a competitive process to be the speaker at Harvard, which we can get into if you want to, but it really is like multiple levels of work to do. And so the power of not knowing was like, that was like I scribbled it down in a couple of my journals, my random notebooks lying around, like, okay, if I get the chance to do this, this is what I want to say.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think now, especially in the summer, moving into like being a recent grad, starting my, early career, professional life, there's a lot that's like up in the air. There's a lot that I don't know, right? Like, I thinking about going back to grad school in the future or, working for myself, or there's so many ways to take life forward. And I think it's like a common feeling a lot of 20 somethings feel, and maybe even later in life. It's very universal
Yeah.
feeling
By
of
the way,
just
not
like,
limited to only 20
yeah.
somethings.
Exactly. It's this universal feeling of like, what am I doing? What's next? And so that uncertainty that I felt in college was something that, instead of running from, I learned to sit with. And
Yeah.
that was really kind of like transformative in my college experience. And that's why I wanted to share it, through the speech as well.
First off, I mean it's a great time, especially after any kind of transition and
Hmm.
change and period where there's a shift from one, I guess,
Hmm.
venue to another,
Yeah.
whether it's in academics or otherwise. I wonder if those are natural ways that we either pause and reflect. And yet, because there is this great embracing of not knowing something.
Hmm.
Um, sometimes that makes people anxious, and other times that
Yeah.
makes people really, really joyful and really kind of enthusiastic about the discovery process more than anything
Hmm.
else. And so far, at least in the response that you got from that, and even in your own thinking now, several
Hmm.
weeks and months since that speech,
Yeah.
um, do you find it easier to execute on that a little bit, especially because of the
Mm.
transitions that you're going through right now?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's like you said, you can be very optimistic about it or it can be anxiety inducing. And I think it's hard to be optimistic all the time, right? It's hard to kind of maintain that high energy all the time. And so I think, what I've been able to do as a result of like the summer and reflecting on the speech is also just hear everyone else's interpretation of what that means. I heard people applying it to the business world and the professional environment and what it means and what it looks like in an office setting. And those are things that, I wouldn't have thought of to apply this idea of not knowing to, but like other people had. And it was just fascinating on different social media platforms to see how people interpreted and took this concept of not knowing into their own experiences. And so, yeah, made it easier. It's made me feel like, okay, not everyone knows what they're doing. And a lot of these people that are now kind of talking about it, admitting it, getting that feeling out there, it makes it more comfortable to say, okay, no, I don't know what my 5-year plan is, but that's what makes me interesting, right? That's what makes me an amazing and interesting, exciting person is the fact that I wasn't born knowing I would be a neurosurgeon or born knowing I was going to be a lawyer. There was a journey to figuring that out and knowing that journey, learning about that journey from someone. That's what makes any individual exciting, right? It makes any individual unique is how they got where they are, not just knowing where they're going. And so, yeah, I think it's been definitely exciting to kind of like think about and sit with that, especially as I, move into starting a new career and navigating it for myself. I think being able to share it with the world validated it in my own head a little bit. So,
Mm, yeah.
yeah.
And that validation is important to a degree, right? And
Hmm.
the part of at least trusting the journey
Yeah.
is, ample, at least for some people, and yet for other people, that's really kind of like, oh
It's
my
hard.
gosh, there's it's hard. It's there's not a lot of
Yeah.
certainty there. And
Right.
in your case, though, especially after you mentioned that there are people who looked at that idea of the power of not knowing in different venues, in venues that you
Hmm.
hadn't even thought of before.
Hmm.
For you personally, when you think now about that idea of trusting the journey,
Hmm.
idea of the discovery process, and being okay with that, is there an element also where, as other people interpret that it sort of provides a little bit more empathy for you as you go through, no matter, for anyone, whether they're going through college or a job switch
Hmm.
or family transitions, um, that idea of not knowing allows for a better sense of understanding and empathy and dialogue. That's actually needed to, more than anything
Right.
else, solve problems.
Yeah, definitely. I think what it's taught me in conversation is I find myself asking different types of questions, right? And when I'm talking to, say, high school students or mentoring kids about, college and everything, it's not like, what do you want to be when you grow up, or what do you want to do? And what is your career going to look like as a job title? It's more like, what are you passionate about? What do you bring to your community? What do you bring to your family? If I'm talking to like 20 somethings or early 30s, right? Like, what has this job taught you? And what do you hope to learn from your next job, right? Rather than what is your next move? What city are you going to live in, right? Like
Right.
those hard and fast questions are difficult to answer. And people expect you to answer them with certainty, right? Like, this is the job I'm going to be in for the next X amount of years. And then I plan to like climb this corporate ladder and become this.
Right.
And it's like, okay, that's not what I'm asking. It's what I'm interested in is knowing how you sat in your experience as an entry level analyst and how that informs your next decision of where you want to go, right? And that question opens up, I think, more space for people to be like, oh, like I walked into this job thinking I was going to feel this way. I actually felt this way. And that's what I learned about myself, right? And then all of a sudden, you're learning so much about that person's journey and their experience, who they are as an individual, rather than just, what their next moves are. And I think, like, so that calculated conversation changes to become one that's more about getting to know each other and each other's journeys. So I think that's really how it's showed up for me, is just the way that I talk to people and, ask about their people's past and their futures, the way they've reflected on it. All of that teaches me so much just in having those conversations, more than I would learn from a job title. So
I
yeah.
used to I used to ask a lot in the doctor's office about, like, especially with kids,
Hmm.
what do you want to be when you grow up? And I
Right.
stopped doing that a couple of years ago because it was so much more interesting, as you said, to ask, well, what do
Hmm.
you like doing?
Yeah.
What do you actually don't like doing? What do you actually, find
Hmm.
yourself very passionate about? And I think you're right. Those are much, much more open-ended, and they
Hmm.
don't tend to be cul-de-sac questions, where
Exactly.
the dialogue sort of stops. Well, yep, this is what I'm doing, and what's next. And I have to admit that, even as a parent, as
Hmm.
someone in a very, very, with a lot of kind of backdrop of being Indian and South Asian in heritage, there you got to fight a lot to prevent yourself from asking that question, a lot too. So I think that's really important. I
Right.
mentioned the word empathy, and the more and more I've
Mm.
been thinking a lot lately about spaces that kind of describe empathy
Right.
and assumption. And I begin to think of these kind of like, I mean, for lack of a better way to put it, empathy pastures, versus cramped boxes.
Mm.
So you have pastures or meadows of empathy, and you have these cramped boxes of assumption. And sometimes you need sort of thoughtful inquiry to engage that empathy. And sometimes you have to confine things to boxes in order to enact change and solve problems very rapidly. And I'm curious now, like in thinking about what you spoke about, and now sort of in this period of transition, have you found it easier to maybe harmonize the two together, where you have like sort of
Mm.
areas of open space, and yet sometimes you really do need to make very quick and fast assumptions in order to execute and make a decision on something?
Yeah,
Hopefully
I
that
guess
makes sense, by the way.
sure. What do you, I guess I would love to just hear more about the latter half, making the assumptions or the kind of closed space. What are you kind of imagining by that? Do you have an
Sometimes,
example?
when I think of people who are in positions of leadership, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
there are a closed set of circumstances that they really have to synthesize
Mm,
fast, understand, and make a decision on.
mm,
And then there's other opportunities to really listen and really deeply empathize and really,
mm-hmm.
really, understand and empathize better. So,
Mm-hmm.
it's not so black and white, and yet you have to be able to harmonize the two. And I'm just curious how you think of
Yeah.
that, particularly in the context of what you spoke about.
Yeah, I think empathy was a big part of the speech writing process and how I thought about it and how I thought about, what I wanted to deliver it as, right? And I think throughout the process, like, um, you know, campus was a pretty crazy time a couple months ago. Around commencement was the same time that, the encampments were going on at universities across the world. Harvard was wanting to make decisions that, you know, um, tried to honor its students and its faculty and, didn't want it to be a crazy, like, fire show that we'd seen at like other universities. They were really trying to not do the worst, right? And so I think in that kind of crazy time, there's lots of division on campus. There was people just like it was a tough environment to be in, to say the
Sure.
least. And in that time, like, I myself am not a student activist by profession by any means, right? Like, it
Right.
was not the heart and center of my resume, of who I am, of what I spent my time doing in college. There were other students that were at the forefront of this movement, that were, on ground every day, kind of like doing the things that activism needs to be doing. And I was supportive, and I followed along with all of that, but I wasn't necessarily a poster child like student activist, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so, like, this moment, this opportunity to give the speech was more of like, okay, I'm hearing from my peers. I was one of the student leaders on campus. I was a class marshal for the class of 2024. So I was hearing from students being like, is there anything you can do as a student advocate to like help us get our degrees? And we were calling up the deans. We were trying to like have these conversations at the higher level of the college. We were doing our best, and yet it just wasn't like, it was hard, right? It was hard to kind of feel that momentum. And when I was notified that I would be the speaker for commencement, it was actually the committee that I worked with, that was made up of three professors at the college and three students, and they suggested, like, you should talk about what's going on right now in your speech. And it
Mm.
was that initial conversation and 4 weeks of working with the team that led to kind of what I said that day. Of course, there
Yeah.
were current events decisions made the day before commencement by the Harvard Corporation that definitely influenced what I added on to my speech. Um, but empathy in that moment was key, because I wasn't one of the students that had their degree withheld. I'm not
Yeah.
Palestinian. I'm not Israeli. I have no, like, you know racial or ethnic per se connection to what's going on across the world. But kind of seeing a lot of the South Asian community members who were on ground, like the leaders, the student activists, those were my peers whose degrees were withheld, and for the reason of engaging in protest, which by like the freedoms of our country is a right that we have, right, as citizens of America. And
Yeah.
so from a democracy perspective, I was just like, okay, this is not just, this is not, what's going on here is like not sitting well with me. And my grandpa was there at commencement. My grandparents were both there. My parents were there, and they were worried. They were like, please don't like put yourself in harm's way. Don't take any dangerous decisions. You have the responsibility of giving a speech, like, do it right. Why, at one point, like, my family was like, why, you're not Palestinian, why do you care, kind of thing. And I was
Mm.
like, Yeah, like I'm Tamil, I'm Indian, I'm, South Indian, whatever. I have these identities. I'm not necessarily directly connected, but people are dying, right? And I'm like, we're human, we're all human. We know we can only imagine what that pain and suffering feels and looks like. Like we are in
Of
such a
course.
privileged
Yeah.
position to be, physically safe and, have the things we need. We're privileged to have that, but we're all human. We could imagine if that were us, what we'd be going through. And it's that
Mm.
like level of empathy and thinking that really, like, I feel like that's where the strength and the courage for me to do what I did came from, was the people that were, also empathizing. They were at the forefront of the protest doing these things, and I was seeing them and inspired by those students, at how much they cared about a humanitarian issue that they didn't necessarily have direct ties to, but were passionate
Mm.
about. And so seeing those students inspired me, and I think gave me the strength and courage to do what I did. Because looking back, I was like, I don't know how I did that. That was scary.
You,
It was
I think
scary.
yeah, totally. And what you're talking about actually, if anything, really does
Mhm.
kind of encapsulate exactly what I was mentioning, where you have these really, really important areas of empathy. And
Right.
at the end, there's a calculus to making a decision as to
Mhm.
what you want to talk about, what you want to actually execute. And yes,
Mhm.
there are risks involved. Yes, there are even, kind of an understanding from people who care about you, that may not actually exist in the way that you imagine. And yet actually really relaying your thoughts in a way that's going to be purposeful and authentic
Mhm.
and incredibly, I think, grounded, is something that you accomplished. I it's funny to me, you're someone who grew up in Nebraska,
Mhm.
and you wouldn't always equate, being able to relate, perhaps, from saying, finding common ground with Nebraska and the sort of campus at Harvard. So I'm just
Mhm.
curious, like both from this experience and even from the experiences that you had so far, what have you found in common actually growing up in Nebraska and being a student at Harvard?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big question. I think I had a lot of self-reflective moments throughout being at Harvard. They're two very different places, like you mentioned.
Yeah,
Politically, the people, the diversity, are all things that are vastly different, I'd say, between Nebraska and Harvard. My experience in Nebraska, I'd, gone to public school for most of my life, but then in high school, I did go to a all girls like Catholic school. And so for me, like that environment was completely new. I had never kind of been around that many people. There was not much, I would say, as much diversity as Harvard has by far, right? And
sure.
so my experience there, going to a Catholic school, we were required to take theology classes. I'm not Catholic myself, so the way I showed up in that environment also required myself to have a little bit of empathy, right? To relate to, okay, I grew up in a
Mm,
more like Hindu Indian household. Like, what did that look like? We were not super religious as a family, but very involved spiritually. And so thinking about questions about life and
yeah,
being a good person and what does it mean to be like a kind and humble and empathetic human being. What are those things were a lot of the religious questions my parents grappled with, and more of a spiritual light, right? And so showing up in a Catholic space, I found I looked for ways to relate to people around me. And there is common ground, right? There is some
yeah,
shared sense of like what it means to be a good person, like to do good for others, to not, do harm for others. There's lots of things you can relate to. And so I kind of like, found myself looking for those things in my theology classes, being able to relate in that way, even if I didn't necessarily wasn't on the same page when it came to the mythology of religion,
yeah.
and the stories and the blah blah blah, right, that surround these institutional religions. I could relate to the core of what was, a lot of what was being shared, but there were also lots of differences. There were a lot of things with the religion and the space that I really did not agree with and really did not relate to. And in those moments, I found myself standing up for what I believed, even in spaces where, that was questioned or challenged. And so at Harvard,
Yeah.
it was like Harvard was like so much more diverse. I'd never met the kind of people that I'd met, on campus. And so it was like, it was like, okay, now it's time for me to be super open minded, to just hear from everyone, take everything in like a sponge, and then sit with it and make my decisions based on, what I'm learning from everyone, rather than judging people, right? Rather than
Yeah.
passing kind of comments on why someone believes the way they believe, and questioning that. It's more about learning, okay, where do you come from, why do you believe what you believe, and is there something here that we can relate to? And more often than not, I always find that there is something between two humans, any humans in the world, that is a shared experience, that is a common feeling, that is a common understanding of life, right? And as long
Can,
as we kind
can
of latch onto that, it's like, it's helpful to navigate.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Did coming from Nebraska, a place that was probably a little bit more with a little bit more
Hmm.
homogeneity than being in Cambridge or in Harvard, at Harvard, uh, was it is it that much more difficult, perhaps, to find yourself actually making sure that you're sensitive to
Mm,
so many other different vantage points, because it's a lot easier to sort of like swim in the same lane as everybody else
right.
if it's a little bit more homogenous of a society. I'm just curious whether or not that was something that you had at all had to negotiate.
Yeah, I think there's definitely like, growing up in the Midwest is a very unique experience that is often underrepresented at universities that are like the
Yeah.
Ivy Leagues, right? Like that experience of being from the American Midwest is very different from coming from a coast, because you like the exposure you have at a young age to a lot of things on the coasts is not nearly what you receive growing up here, right?
Sure.
And we see that with studies on innovation, and just where we have innovation coming from, where knowledge transmits through, kind of where knowledge flourishes and grows. It's like Midwest is often behind in those trends. And so for me, like coming to Harvard, there was a lot of language that I needed to like I was
Mm,
hearing that I hadn't heard before, right? Like very inclusive, sensitive language that
yeah.
wasn't necessarily like the everyday in Nebraska. Like, as much as it was different and something I hadn't, really been exposed to, I found myself kind of like learning, okay. And it's a very liberal space, right? Like
Yeah.
the East Coast, like these colleges, they are very liberal spaces, and Nebraska is conservative. Most of my neighbors like were Trump supporters. Like it's just like the space I was coming from and where I was going were like vastly different. And I don't think I really realized until the end of my college experience how much different those two upbringings were.
Mm,
And so, yeah, there was definitely moments where I was like navigating new language, new approaches to thinking about things. And in those moments, just found myself like questioning, okay, is this going to bother me and my decision making, or can I just be a respectful person for others, right? And
yeah.
create a safe space
Yeah.
for others. And that was really it. Was like, I can ask for what I need, and I can also respect what others need. And
Yeah.
so, yeah.
And I love that we went from finding commonalities with what's actually in Nebraska and Harvard
Mhm.
to in a way understanding those differences and sort of
Right.
moving forward in a way that's respectful and kind and
Mhm.
compassionate and all the things that you just mentioned.
Yeah.
You talked once about desensitizing in a speech you gave
Mm.
about the voice of democracy. And I was really sort of struck by that. Are those who wield power levers of authority and investment, for that matter, as well as those who found their voices, um, especially in protest, are they bound at some point to kind of suffer from complacency? Because
Mm.
the people who are actually in a position of power versus the people who are protesting against, for that matter, that power, um, if they get desensitized, is there the inevitable complacency that sort of sets in? And then again, how do you combat that?
Yeah, I mean it's a big question, and I think the idea of desensitizing that I talked about in the speech that I gave at the Voice of Democracy competition, that was in 2020. And at that time, it was mass shootings, it was George Floyd, it was, civil unrest across the country. And you can ask the same question, right? Were people desensitized to that? Was every mass shooting we heard about just like the previous one? Like, are we desensitized to the kids that died in those, situations? Same with, police brutality and the Black Lives Matter movement. Like, are we desensitized, right, as a society? And these
Mm.
things are not, they're still happening today. There's these problems
Sure.
that I
Yeah.
talked about,
And they're
and
not
that,
linear either.
right, yeah, they were on my mind in 2020, and they're still on my mind 4 years later, which means as a society, have we really done enough, is the question. And so, I mean, this time around, when I, on the situation on campus, and talking about Israel Palestine and the issues going on in Gaza, a lot of people, I think at that time, it's very easy to become desensitized. It's all over the news. All you're seeing is like people dying, right? And like, as much as that is like at its core, the most painful and horrific thing ever, anything that you've had repeated a multitude of times, can fall victim to that desensitizing. And so I think that is why the work of these
Mm.
student activists is so incredibly important, is because these students,
Yeah.
amongst everything going on in their life, find the time to remind everyone on a daily basis that, okay, you might have everything in the world working toward you being desensitized or complacent, but we are here to remind you that that is not the case,
Yeah.
right? They are
Yeah.
literally doing the reminding for you. It's a notification in real life that takes a lot of time and effort that these students are putting in. And so, and they
I
risk
love
a
that, by the
lot.
way.
They risk a lot, to
Yeah.
remind you that this is something that should be on your mind. And so when it comes to like higher officials and people in power, I think when you get to that point, transparency is what is most important. That's what
Mm.
people and students and everyone across the world want to hear, is like, we all know and we all understand that money is what moves these powerful institutions. It is at the heart and core of our institutions and our schools, universities, whether we like to admit it or not. It's there, right?
Sure.
And so, like, it's a big part of how decisions are made, and schools don't like to admit that. But I think the transparency from administrators would help, right? It's like, okay, this is one factor of something we have to consider, but when you look at the humanitarian issue, this is where we stand. And like that
Mm.
kind of, if we can just like parse and separate out why we're making the decisions we're making and be transparent in that way, then I think the conversation between, say, students and admin becomes a lot more productive. It doesn't get to the point of, oh, I hate you, you hate me, like boohoo, like that's
Yeah.
unproductive for everyone.
Well,
Yeah,
and
like,
and I love the fact that you
yeah.
marry this idea of constant reminders that students and other activists are really, really pounding on, and that could be for any issue whatsoever.
Hmm.
And the idea that transparency has to be the antidote for
Exactly.
so that not only can those messages be very, very vocalized and also
Hmm.
be there for people to get reminded of it, but so that there can be actually really engaging dialogue. You,
Right.
you mentioned earlier that you have a background as Nebraskan, as a South Indian, as a
Hmm.
as a Hindu. I mean, all these identities, of course, that we all wear and carry on us. Um, I'm curious, particularly as a South Asian American, in the backdrop of all of this, what do you think have been some of the misconceptions commonly about South Asian students that you've encountered this past year, particularly in the context of what you just mentioned with, how student activism has evolved and even kind of bubbled up over this
Hmm.
past year or so?
Yeah, it's definitely something I've been thinking a lot about and reflecting on. I think, brown America as it is has its own history of being in the United States, of, the diaspora, and, when and where immigration took place. And a lot of us, at least my parents, had immigrated to the US, and their view of being here in the US is much different than myself, who was born here and kind of, navigates these type of situations differently. And so I'd say like the older generations, my parents and older, there's a sense that I feel in the South Asian community of like being risk averse. And that sense of being risk averse is I understand where it's coming from, right? It's a sense of safety. It's like wanting to belong, wanting to
Yeah,
assimilate, wanting to be a part of the place that you're going to, America, right? To embrace that means to be risk averse in some way, shape, or form. And so I think for like South Asian students on campus, I was like really amazed to see how many South Asian students were mobilizing for this effort. Like a lot of the people at the forefront of, the effort on Harvard's campus, at least, were South Asian, we're Indian, Pakistani. Like it was really awesome to see that. And I think it was like a generational difference. Like I don't think that that necessarily was happening beforehand or in a few generations before that, because like they had to be risk averse in order to succeed. They had to be a little more careful in like what positions of power they were in and what they were saying, because you were representing what it means to be South Asian in America, the decisions that you're taking. And so our generation, I think we're having a little bit more of a, I don't know, this is like what is it, Gen X, Gen Alpha energy that's like upcoming.
right.
That is a little bit more like we are also Americans in the same, we're not like hyphenated. We're not like, we don't have anything to necessarily attach ourselves to in terms of like proving that we are risk averse and safe. And like we will
Mm,
do the right thing. And that is what we do proudly. I like a lot of us were also very key members of the South Asian community at Harvard as well. And so we were
yeah,
also the ones like embracing our culture, like, doing the dance shows, doing the like, songs, the singing, the food, everything. We love all of that, but we also
yeah.
love standing for justice and saying what needs to be said when it needs to be said. Like I think we're figuring out a way to hold both, in a way that I don't
Yeah.
think Brown America has seen yet. And so, yeah, I
I
think
think you're
that's kind
so
of what
right with
our,
that, right?
yeah.
Yeah. I think you're so right with that, that, it's yet another example of how two things can be true at the exact same time.
Hmm.
And they shouldn't be mutually exclusive. And there
Right.
are ways to, not only just swim in every lane, but to be authentic about it, for sure. And I do
Hmm.
think that there's a twist to this, of course, right? I mean, we have I was born and brought up here, and yet I face these things a little bit differently as a parent, as someone who's a
Sure.
little bit, now in my mid 50s. And at the same time, I know, thankfully, as we talked about earlier, like, it would be incorrect to assume that there are 70 or 80-year-olds who don't believe in these movements and,
Hmm.
are
Right.
not willing to lend themselves to, put that risk out there. I'm curious, about, one thing here. You I think, shared, that you did not actually participate, in the protest encampments themselves. And so I'm curious whether or not you actually found power or peace, or were there any surprises, for you personally, like even elements of like guilt or even exclusion, because you made a conscious choice not to necessarily participate, or be in one of those encampments.
Yeah. I mean, I
By
think,
the way, the reason I ask all
hmm,
that is because um, I do think that students, humans, they go through all
right.
these emotions,
Of
right?
course.
When you're
Yeah.
really thinking about like, how do I engage in a way that fits
Yeah.
me?
Yeah, of course. I mean, yeah, I think like you said, I'm also human. I at points was desensitized, felt like I needed to check myself on my own complacency. There was a lot of that, right? A lot of those feelings going on. And I think for me, I was supportive of and loved the efforts that students were taking. But I think for me, the previous fall, I had been doxxed, and that was out of my control. I was I was the co-president of the South Asian Association the year before. And so our board, my name, and everything had been leaked. And right wing organizations had kind of taken that on. There was like a spreadsheet going around saying that we were, anti-Semites and all of this. And so that really scared me. I genuinely like
Mm,
was fearful of leaving my dorm room for about 3 to 4 days, because there was a truck parked in Harvard Yard with the faces and names of a lot of my South Asian peers, just branded as anti-Semites. And it's like, seeing that really shook me. My name and face wasn't on there, but like literally the people that were, my friends, my peers in the movement were. And a lot of them were brown, a lot of them were hijabi. Like they were, it's clear like the motive of why someone would do this. It was so political, it was so disgusting. It was very
Yeah.
scary, it was terrifying. It scared me for my personal safety, for my well-being, for my health, for my future, for my professional career. And it wasn't just me thinking this, it was all the hundreds of South Asian students of color on campus who felt this type of fear. And so coming back from that, like it took me a while to like feel comfortable on campus again, only to be hit with a lot of this in the spring. And so I
Yeah.
think my personal decision making, and that's why a lot of students wore masks during the protests, was to keep that anonymity and protect themselves.
Mm.
And so a lot of students would wear masks or have kind of protective covering so that media and stuff wouldn't take advantage of their names and faces. Like there's
Right.
a lot of that stuff going on, right? So I think for me it was just a little bit difficult to hold that fear and be in that space all at the same time. And I think there's many different ways of being involved in being an activist. Protests are awesome, they're like really out there, they get the message going. For me, I think in that moment I found my advocacy and activism in different ways. For me, it was having personal conversations with my parents, with my grandparents, with my community members, with my friends from Omaha, with my friends at different colleges, learning about what other colleges were going through, how protests were happening at universities across the country, at state schools. Those were the types of like conversations, advocacy, and like stuff that I was interested in doing and felt myself able to do in that moment. And then
Yeah.
of course when the moment of the speech came around, that was also something I felt comfortable doing and felt very passionate and strongly about doing. And so I think it's also about just like having a conversation with yourself and knowing in this moment in time, what does my advocacy look like? What does it need to look like? What can I do comfortably and in a space that is, right for me? And I think that's the other thing is like villainizing people for not doing a certain type of advocacy or activism is also unproductive, right?
Yeah.
Like I love
Totally.
having conversations with higher level deans and people that need to be hearing these things, and I'm very happy to do that. Immediately will do that. And that's what I felt comfortable doing at the time. So that's kind of how
Mm.
I was able to engage the way I wanted to.
What did you have to maybe in getting comfortable with that and
Hmm.
in going through those emotions and going through and finding again the both power and the peace in
Hmm.
that decision? Um, what you have to unlearn about yourself as a South Asian American college student in 2024?
What did I have to unlearn? That's an interesting question. Um, I think I had one major kind of learning that I went through was to not care so much about what everyone thinks. I think that's something that is very present in South Asian culture and in South Asian households is to always think about what other people might say and how they might perceive you and what you might be branded as or how others might understand you. And in that moment, like there was a lot going through my head, right, in decision making when it comes to what am I going to do? What am I going to say? What would be right? What's the right thing to say? What are the right words? A lot of that, was like, okay, I will be branded as X, Y, or Z if I say this. I will be understood as X, Y, or Z if I say this. And I had to let go of that in that moment. I really did. I had
Mm.
to kind of, let that go behind me and just think, what do I think is right for humanity and for people to hear? What message I have? All I have is about 6 to 8 minutes of an audience's attention. That's all I get,
Right.
right? And what do I do in that time? What is right by me to do in that time? And so you
Mm.
do have to be a little bit like put the blinders on in moments like that. And that's really what helped me connect with myself, connect with the power that I needed to just have in that moment, was to put the blinders on, to not see like to not know what professors were around
Yeah.
me, what parents would be watching me, what friends would be around me, my friends' political views, like juggling all of that in my head at that moment would have caused chaos, right? I needed the blinders on to be able to focus on what my definition of justice was and how I wanted to achieve that. So I think that's the biggest thing I've unlearned is like knowing
Yeah.
when to care about others' opinions and viewpoints and welcome those when you need them, but also be able to put the blinders on when you need to as well.
Mm. It's
Um,
almost like
so yeah,
a great way to have that, hopefully not just temporary clarity that you need
right,
to really just
exactly.
sort of, you know, get that empowerment
Hmm.
and find a way to express both the peace and the power. Um,
Right.
you talk about like, people not being around you and of course being cognizant of them and yet expressing yourself in a way that is where you find that clarity, you find that empowerment, um, especially in America, where policymakers and politicians do not come from the generation of students.
Mm.
The Harrison Waltz ticket or the Trump and Vance tickets are of people who are older and they may have different political ideologies.
Hmm.
And I make no mistake, I'm a very, very avid Harrison Waltz
Hmm.
supporter. But when we think about those who are both in power and running for office, related back again to policy and their
Hmm.
politics, do you find it, at least in this phase of your, kind of post-student career and the students who are now, coming, do these policymakers, are they fitting the needs of the student community? Are they actually, are they hearing the sentiment, or are there still a whole lot of questions and unfinished business that's out there constantly, um,
Hmm.
that drive what the sentiment of student activists, are? Meaning that, like, well, is it's just not enough?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's almost the way I see it, it's like people are having conversations, but not productively and not with each other. A lot
Mm,
of I think the environment, the political environment in America today is very polarized, and I find it very difficult to navigate conversations with people in today's day. And I think this is something that I also just noticed growing up in Nebraska. I had a lot of friends who didn't believe what I believed, who were on the other side of the political spectrum, who, just had vastly different views on issues that I did, but I was still like friends with them, acquaintances with them, neighbors with them. I still respected them as human beings, like as people, right? And one thing that like just being in a very liberal space then in Harvard, there's not always tolerance for views that are different from your own. And that I think is a reflection
mm,
of the broader polarization in our country, is that how willing are you to sit down and have a conversation with someone who literally believes the complete opposite thing that you do, right?
right.
A lot of people don't even have the patience to do that anymore. They're like, you are a bad person because you believe what you believe. And I think that type of closing off is not productive for anyone, right? And so I
Sure.
think what I want to see from like presidential candidates, the Harris ticket, Trump ticket, whatever it may be, they're we're too far away from each other to be productive. And so what I like, as much as I might align one way or another, I still just feel like a vastly unproductive space
Mm,
where, people like presidential candidates, but also people at universities, students, like the types of conversations we're having, I think just need to change in content for us to be able to be productive as a society and as a government. And I think there's always more to be done with talking to students. Students have that mindset because we have limited time in college. We have studies, we have, we're making friends, we have relationship, we're balancing all the things of life all at the same time.
right.
And you do that more as you grow to be an adult and take on more responsibilities and everything like that. But I think in that moment to make time and space for those conversations, to listen to the way that students are thinking, especially in an academic environment. You're having a lot of these discussions in class. You're talking about what civil disobedience looked like, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. You're reading civil disobedient books in class. But then the minute that you do it on campus and you like live those books and teachings, it's supposedly wrong, right? And so
Right.
there's just inconsistency. There's
Yeah.
inconsistency in our political spaces, and in the way that we judge people. And so a lot of
Mm.
people like to brand student activists and Gen Z as like, they don't know what they're doing. They're just like endlessly fighting for something. And, they're never satisfied and blah, blah, blah. But that's not the case. Like students are very well informed. They know, they've done the research. They've done more research than any of these politicians have on the history of these issues, on how people negotiated in the past. The demands they make, the claims they make have substance. And I think respecting your opponent is something that we've lost in the political arena today, both at the presidential level, but also between
Yeah.
admin and students. Respect the opponent, for what they bring to the table, and navigate those conversations as professionals. I think that's all that students really ask, is hear us out as people and as well-informed individuals, rather than dismissing us as, an uninformed body.
Yeah, no, that's such a important interrogation that we have to sort of do with ourselves in
Exactly.
order to, respect and listen a little bit more appropriately, and also in an
Hmm.
engaged way that develops relationships more than anything else. I'll get you out of here on this. For new students now entering this
Hmm.
fall, they're entering a space that they haven't been in.
Yeah.
That's going to be one of discussion and
Right.
activism and really a vibrant place, not only just for learning,
Hmm.
but for growing and developing. And then also for those who are entering postgraduate life, like you are, and now embarking on their own on new journeys in spaces that are unknown and
Hmm.
embracing that for sure. What's something you believe they all collectively, um, both of those groups perhaps, what's something you believe they should feel optimistic about now
Mm.
as they go forward?
I think we should feel optimistic that we are being challenged. And as difficult as it is to exist in one of the most stressful, anxiety inducing climates that we've seen in the last like 50, 60 years, right? Like I talked to older people who've gone to college in different times. And of course, there was like stuff going on, but the anxiety and the level of stress that I think our country is going through right now is unprecedented to grow up in. It's unprecedented to develop as an adolescent. And that's a challenge we're presented with, right? Nothing is easy. It's not. And I think that challenge is something that we should be optimistic about, because it means that society is changing, that things are becoming better, becoming different, becoming more inclusive, becoming spaces for all of us to be in, right? I think there and to not I think like walking into these spaces, they are not perfect spaces. So don't expect them to be, right? Like I think it's easy to glorify, like going to Harvard, going to, Ivy League schools or any big step. Like if no one in your family's gone to college, going to any college is a big step, right? Those are glorifying, those are moments that we tend to glorify, and we're like, oh, this is going to be everything for me, this is going to be perfect, this is going to have what I need. And it might not, it may fall short of those really glorified expectations. So, and that's a challenge for you to do something, for you, like that is an opportunity for you to make a difference in your community, for you to like identify the pain points and solve them, right? That's what future leaders and change makers do, is they look for these gaps and they fill them, right? And so I think that's what's exciting about our generation. I think we know that we want change to happen and we'll do it. And I think that's an exciting thing. Like if you're not challenged, you're not growing. And I think like that is what, whether you're an incoming freshman or a graduating senior, um, it's a moment, it's a very special time to be in that moment where you're entering a new life, leaving an old one behind. And to be excited about the challenge is what's on my mind, and what I hope other students also carry with them.
Well, Shruti, meeting the challenge, helping others to meet that challenge, and really
Hmm.
embracing a lot that's both known and unknown. I know people are paying attention. Thank you so much for joining us today. This
Yeah,
is really a treat, and I hope we can visit with you down the road.
of course. Thank you so much for having me. It was an awesome and fruitful conversation. So thank you for the time and space.
You're listening to Trust Me, I Know What I'm Doing. Stay tuned.